A lot of people in today's liberty movement, the broader movement for liberty, are totally wasting their time. They're like a hamster on a wheel, running in place, getting nowhere. And I think the big problem with many, not everyone, is that too many of them focus so much time, energy, and money on elections as their primary strategy for liberty, or in many cases, their only strategy for liberty. They spend all their days talking about who they're going to vote for and which candidate is less bad on this thing or that thing. But for the founders, the founding generation would not even recognize this as an effective or proper strategy in response to living under the largest government in history, which is what we have today. And that's because of three main points that I'm going to cover on this episode here. First of all, it has nothing to do with how the founding generation defined a free people. So we're going to look at how they saw a free people. It ignores the strategy they specifically gave us to respond to usurpations of power, exercises of power beyond the limits of the Constitution. And three, it misses a few key ingredients that are absolutely needed to get from where we are today, living under the largest government in history, to where we want to be, living in a real land of the free. I'll cover all that and more in just a moment, but first of all, welcome and thank you for joining me here on the path to liberty. My name is Michael Bolden with the 10th Amendment Center, and this is the show for Monday, June 3rd, 2024. Hope you had an awesome weekend. I appreciate you spending some of your time with me today, but let's get right to it. And I want to start out with this question. How do we define a free people, or how should we? For the founding generation, I think this is the best definition of it. John Dickinson, who wrote the Letters from a Farmer in Pennsylvania, the most widely read documents on American liberty up until publication of Thomas Paine's Common Sense in 1776. So he wrote these in 1767 in response to the Townshend Acts. Everyone read them. This was really kind of the exposition of the patriot cause, the patriot views. And Dickinson asked that exact question. For who are a free people? All caps, if you could see it here on the screen here. So that isn't just email forwards. For who are a free people? Not those over whom government is reasonable and equitably exercised, but those who live under a government so constitutionally checked and controlled that proper provision is made against its being otherwise exercised. In short, if you live in a situation where government has a bunch of power, but you happen to find the right people to go in office and they don't use that power in bad ways, you're not a free people. You're literally still living in a state of luck at best. It's only a free people if government tries to go beyond its limits, there are either so many structural or physical restraints on them, they literally cannot. That's the definition of freedom for the American Revolution. St. George Tucker reiterated this decades later in 1803, writing the first kind of full-length commentary about the legal meaning of the Constitution. Thomas Jefferson loved this book. View of the Constitution of the United States. He had the same take. It is the due restraint and not the moderation of rulers that constitutes a state of liberty, as the power to oppress, though never exercised, does a state of slavery. As long as they have the power, it's not merely about trying to get the right people in power to not use that power or to use it against your opponents or to use it in ways that you support. Because as long as that power exists, you're literally still on your knees at the mercy of the people who have that power. The founding generation recognized this. The old revolutionaries understood this. So again, in other words, just trying to find the right people to wield power or choose not to is not a state of freedom. It's luck. And that's how Patrick Henry put it during the Virginia Ratifying Convention. He said, if you have a good president, senators, and representatives, there is no danger. But can this be expected from human nature? If you answered the question no, I'm sure Patrick Henry would give you a passing grade today, but certainly the warning should make sense to us. Just because you happen to have good people in power today, that doesn't mean they're going to live forever. We're not going to live forever. None of us. And human nature should be understood that human beings are incredibly flawed creatures. All of us are. I wouldn't trust myself with power. This is the dumbest thing. You don't want anyone to have too much power. Power to endanger the public liberty is something you absolutely have to oppose. So if you have a good president, senators, and representatives, there is no danger. But can this be expected from human nature? That's Patrick Henry in the Virginia Ratifying Convention, June of 1788. He points out that without real checks, so as long as government can get away with doing stuff, and some of what the anti-federalists were complaining about here in context here, against ratification of the Constitution, what they're complaining about is that there are too many phrases in the Constitution, too many legal terms in the Constitution, that even if people like Mr. Wilson and others could explain what they meant in law at the time, it was understood that human nature would, over time, people would get in power and try to read those phrases and clauses like general welfare, for example, and necessary and proper, in broader and broader ways to aggrandize themselves, to give themselves more power. And Henry, again, without real checks, it will not suffice. Suffice that some of these people are good. So even if you can get a few people in power that are actually, or in office, that are good guys, that's still not good enough. That's not the goal here. He said a good president or senator or representative will have a natural weakness. Virtue will slumber. The wicked will be continually watching. And consequently, you will be undone. We did not pay attention to Patrick Henry's warnings. Of course, I covered this idea of what makes a free people to the founding generation, to the old revolutionaries, a number of times, but I did a full episode on this a couple of years ago. Who are a free people? That will be in the show notes. I do encourage you to check it out when you have a chance. And here's Thomas Paine with a similar take on this. He said it is not, this is in Rights of Man, Part 2, it is not because a part of the government is elective that makes it less of a despotism. If the persons so elected possess afterwards unlimited powers. So again, it's about the power they are able to wield. And if they either have unlimited power or if they're allowed to exercise unlimited power. So for example, Thomas Jefferson in 1791 arguing against the First National Bank from Hamilton, he said, this is not authorized by the Constitution. And I know some people are basically making the argument that this is good, this is expedient to do anyways, and it's going to expire over time. And he said, look, no, that's a bad choice. Because as soon as you give them the power to go beyond the limits of the Constitution in one situation, they will have the reason that they need, the precedent, the foundation to go beyond in every situation. He said it gives them a boundless field of power, allowing them, as soon as they go beyond the limits of the power and they're not kept in check, they in essence have started the process of exercising unlimited power. Sometimes it takes time. And if we're not unlimited power in a situation where we have the largest government, the largest empire in history, a government that most people look to tell us if it follows the rules that we, the people of the several states, have given to it. That is not the definition of something being kept in check, not even close. So Paine is pointing out, as long as they have unlimited powers, this is still a despotism, even if you can pick your own leaders. He said election in this case becomes separated from representation. You don't really have representation in that situation. And the candidates, they're not candidates to be representatives. To Thomas Paine, they are candidates for despotism. And Thomas Jefferson summed it up like this: a free people claim their rights as derived from the laws of nature and not as the gift of their chief magistrate. So in some review of the Rights of British America in 1774, Jefferson is recognizing that a free people aren't a free people just because they happen to have good rulers. That is still a population on its knees begging for scraps. And that brings me to the second question, which is, how are we supposed to respond to usurpations of power? A usurpation, as Tucker called it, St. George Tucker called it, it was treason against the sovereignty or final authority of the people. If power flows from the people to the government, as it's supposed to, and government is only authorized to exercise those powers that the sovereign people of the several states have delegated to the government and nothing more. And when government goes beyond that, they're basically stealing what the people have reserved to themselves, either in their state governments or to themselves, individually or as groups, however you want to define it, it doesn't matter. But the point is, the federal government or any level of government going beyond the powers delegated to it, they are stealing power that they're not authorized to have. Tucker called that treason against sovereignty of the people. And here's even Alexander Hamilton writing in Federalist number 33. Of course, we know he's a flip-flopper, but this is the Federalist Papers here. Federalist 33 was to convince the people of New York to ratify the document. because there was a very strong anti-federalist opposition there in New York and was probably going to lose. But Hamilton and others, Jay and Madison, of course, wrote these papers, and they were influential in New York during ratification, not much outside of it. But the people of New York in the ratification debates, they ratified under these views. They said, okay, you've convinced us, let's go with it. But here's how Hamilton described this. He said, it will not follow from this doctrine that acts of the large society which are not pursuant to its constitutional powers, but which are invasions of the residuary authorities of the smaller societies, will become the supreme law of the land. These will be merely acts of usurpation and will deserve to be treated as such. I would take that Alexander Hamilton over almost every single politician in office today. And in fact, I would take that Alexander Hamilton over most people even running for office, people who have good principles, because they're not going to get into office. And if they do, all they're doing is filing legislation. It goes nowhere. And they're not giving us this message that every time they go beyond the limits of the Constitution, we have to look at it as a theft of power, a treasonous act against the people, the power of the people. And it needs to be treated like that. And how do you treat it like that? Well, Madison followed up on this in the Federalist in number 46. He recommended that states and individuals utilize a refusal to cooperate with officers of the Union. Again, these are not some hippy-dippy protesters in the Bay Area or Berkeley, something like that. This is Alexander Hamilton, a war hero. James Madison, the father of the Constitution, so-called, telling us to use a refusal to cooperate, to refuse to comply, civil disobedience. I would call it civil obedience, really. Obeying the Constitution by not going along and empowering the government to do stuff that it's not supposed to do. All this stuff is going to be linked to in the show notes. I mentioned the other episode, Who Are Free People. I've got another one coming up here in just a moment on how the early times in the Republic, they used these strategies that the founders gave us, plus all the original source documents, Jefferson, Thomas Paine, etc. Alan Mosley organizes a blog post for every single episode over at 10thamendmentcenter.com/path-to-liberty, and I get that published a couple of hours after the live stream is done. We also include a bunch of different platforms. Of course, we live stream on a bunch of mainstream platforms like X and YouTube and Facebook and LinkedIn, etc. We also live stream over at Odyssey.com, which I love, and Rumble.com. We have the audio-only podcast edition all over the place. So if you want to check us out on a different platform, if you happen to notice us missing from one at some point, you'll be able to find us elsewhere. And while I'm here, I want to take a quick moment to say hello to everyone out in the live chat. Again, I appreciate you being here. Whether you're live or in the archive, it does not matter, but I do love doing the live show. And a lot of times I find myself, when I'm watching or listening to things, I tend to lean personally towards watching live shows. I like the interaction a little bit more. So hi to Brewster. I appreciate you out there. Gypsy and Render and Dennis and everyone over on Rumble after the Ron Paul Liberty Report. I appreciate you guys joining in here. Thank you for helping spread the word over on that platform. Everyone over on Odyssey, although I don't have a way to pull that up right now, but let me take a look here and see if I can check out. I've got to go back and forth to apps here, but give me just a moment. Here's Kirk and Cheriton and Haji and Lewis and Alan Melody. Blindly Follow Everyone is a fun one in New Mexico. That's a great screen name. Chris S., John, and everyone else over on Facebook and YouTube and elsewhere. There's Zahar and a few others. Again, I appreciate you guys being here. We'll get the blog post published for this episode in a couple of hours over at 10thamendmentcenter.com/path-to-liberty. So now we're talking about how to respond. Hamilton is telling us that every time they go beyond the limits of the federal power delegated in the Constitution, this is not supreme law. This is not supremacy. Federal supremacy only applies when they are in pursuant of the delegated powers in the Constitution. Anything beyond that is a usurpation of power and needs to be treated as if it's a usurpation of power. And you don't treat a usurpation of power as that by blindly following it. James Madison told us a refusal to cooperate with officers of the Union. Well, here's also one of the first Supreme Court justices, an associate justice nominated by George Washington, James Iredell, also a leading Federalist, but he was kind of not the high nationalist, big government guy. James Iredell in North Carolina. He understood and supported federalism in many ways throughout his career. He died young. Sometimes he wasn't awesome. Sometimes he was. But here he is telling the people at the ratification debates in North Carolina, well, okay, yeah, you might be concerned about how we've drafted some of these things in the Constitution, But we know that a people who loves liberty knows what to do in response to it. And he said, the only resource against usurpation is the inherent right of the people to prevent its exercise. He didn't say it was a mere good idea to try after everything fails, to try after vote the bums out 800 times does not reduce the size and scope and power of the government. He did not say that the resource against a usurpation of power is to go to the federal courts in the hopes that the federal courts will tell the federal government to stop doing what the federal government was never supposed to do in the first place. And this is a guy who was one of the top federal judges in the country at the beginning of the Republic. And his view was the only way to deal with usurpations of power is the inherent right. This is not a constitutional right. It doesn't have to be spelled out in the Constitution that we are given this right, because you don't have a right if it's only given to you from writing on a document. So the only resource against usurpation is the inherent right of the people to prevent its exercise. He continued explaining what that meant. He said the people will resist if the government usurp powers not delegated to it. Now, he was putting out a lot of faith in the people, and a lot of people tell us, like, look, okay, yeah, good in theory, but, that quickly went out the window right after ratification was all done. As soon as the government went into effect, government started usurping power, and they just crushed everybody. That's absolutely a crock. They want you to believe that this was not used, or it was just crushed in every attempt ever. But in another episode that I did titled Don't Try, They'll Crush You, because that's the argument we hear all the time, I cover a number of times of how this was implemented at the beginning of the early years of the American Republic. That is, where state, local, and individual resistance was attempted and actually very successful, despite some modern historical takes to the contrary. For example, in response to the whiskey tax was not the Whiskey Rebellion and the Whiskey Tax was not crushed by the Washington administration. We only hear part of that story. We don't hear about the massive noncompliance and defiance to the act in other areas outside of Western Pennsylvania that forced them to get rid of the tax. It was very successful, this nullification. I covered that in that episode. We also have the nullification of Thomas Jefferson's embargo in his second term. He was great in his first term. His first inaugural, my friend Brian McClanahan, I would call Brian, a friend, acquaintance, a mentor in many ways. So his podcast, if you're not checking out, he had some cool ones on his favorite and least favorite founders, most unknown ones last week. I was thinking of maybe doing my own version of that, maybe a response, and we'll see if we could have a little debate between podcasts. I'm not sure. If you're interested in that, maybe I will do that. But Brian calls Jefferson's first inaugural the most important of all of them. Like, that laid down the American policy, especially foreign and domestic, for the first part of the 19th century. But Jefferson, in his second term, wasn't all that awesome. He did a lot of stuff that he probably shouldn't have been doing. And we know that he himself, the great nullifier, Thomas Jefferson, was nullified. His embargo had a lot of resistance to it. And then we also have another example of resistance by northeastern states to what they called James Madison's War, Mr. Madison's War. So the second thing that we're talking about is how to respond. And people have not been doing this, just merely trying to choose new people in power, people to wield the power of the largest government in history or not wield it, is not how you respond, because, as Iredell put it, the only resource against usurpation is the inherent right of the people to prevent its exercise. And speaking of Thomas Jefferson, he tied this all together in his draft for the Kentucky Resolutions of 1798 against the hated Alien and Sedition Acts, where the Adams administration was punishing and going after the free speech of political opponents. Ooh, that's the first time that's ever happened to us, and we never heard of that before. Anyways, here's how Jefferson put it. In cases of an abuse of the delegated powers, the members of the general government being chosen by the people, a change by the people would be the constitutional remedy. That's Thomas Jefferson speak for when government is doing stuff that you don't like the policy, but they're still within the bounds of the Constitution. Vote the bums out is the proper strategy to respond to it. But that's nowhere close to where we are today. They aren't just mismanaging the post office. They aren't just misusing the power to declare war and declaring war when we don't want them to. They aren't just misusing the power to regulate commerce among the several states. They're using powers that go well beyond the powers delegated to them in the Constitution. Those are usurpations of power. So for everything else, Thomas Jefferson told us what to do. Where powers are assumed, which have not been delegated, a nullification of the act is the rightful remedy. Not a good idea, not a decent remedy, but the only thing that you're supposed to do, just like James Iredell said in 1788, the only thing. So the last thing I want to cover here are some missing ingredients. If we don't have these pieces of the puzzle, it doesn't matter how many times you lobby to get someone in office or for or against various policies and things like that. It's not going to change. It's going to keep getting worse. And I think the number one thing that we're missing is, first of all, a love of liberty. So many people today absolutely despise, hate, or actually fear liberty. We know, as John Adams put it when he was one of the good guys, before the war for independence, that is, that fear is the foundation of most governments. I would just remove the word most from that, and I think that is really what government power is built upon. Fear of a bad thing happening, so you need government to keep things in order, supposedly. That's the argument we get. And John Dickinson starts it out with this: a love of liberty. He said, as a foundation and security of all the rest, I wish you a true love of liberty. And there's a lot in that statement there. I'm not going to unpack it too far, but he's pointing out that everything you want to achieve, your happiness, your prosperity, your security, starts with a true love of liberty. And it's not a true love of liberty to only like things that one team or another does, or to sit around and let them do bad stuff that they're not authorized to do in the first place, or to comply with stuff all the time, because you're not going to comply your way out from under the largest government in history. But that doesn't mean it's going to be easy, so we'll get to that in a moment. As a foundation and security of all the rest, I wish you a true love of liberty. We unfortunately have very little love of liberty in this society. And I know there are some of my libertarian friends out there who are like, oh, yeah, you can do these polls and you can figure out that the huge portion, millions of people are actually libertarian. They just don't know it yet. So they just need to hear the message. And I think that's absolutely bull as well. Most people are very happy to use one political team or another. And sometimes they flip sides on that. They're kind of in the middle. But they're very happy to use the power of a central government, if not a state government. They're very happy to use the power of a central government to force their view on everyone. That is not liberty, even close. Here's also focusing on that same missing ingredient, a love of liberty, is Thomas Jefferson and John Dickinson in one of the most important, but yet also very much ignored documents from the Revolution. This is July 6th, 1775. And if you think about the timing, a few months after the fighting began, the shot heard around the world, Lexington and Concord, the Second Continental Congress responded to the gun control officer offer of General Gage: give up your guns, give up your friends, and we will, we'll let you guys go. But you're going to have to turn over John Hancock, and you're going to have to turn over Samuel Adams. They said no deal. And here's part of what they included in this: our attachment to no nation upon earth should supplant our attachment to liberty. There is no dedication to the mother country, to our local country, to any country whatsoever that goes beyond our love and attachment of liberty. That's John Dickinson and Thomas Jefferson, the declaration of the causes and necessity of taking up arms. So they said it was a requirement because our attachment to liberty went beyond our attachment to the mother country, which is why we have to fight back after they used this gun control scheme and tried to attack us. And here's Thomas Jefferson in a letter to Charles Yancey covering the next missing ingredient, and I think it's education. We've turned our education over to the government. And when government teaches you stuff, government is going to teach you that government is awesome. And the solution to problems comes from government. I came up in a government-run school, and I learned that basically the solution to every one of life's problem was somehow found in government. Now, you may not have had as bad of an experience as I did. Luckily, I was a really bad student. I ignored a lot of the garbage, so maybe I still had opening to learn more. But, they're training us from cradle to grave. They're teaching us this status mentality. But Thomas Jefferson pointed out that if a nation expects to be ignorant and free, it expects what never was and never will be. Now, the final one, missing ingredient that I want to talk about here is something that is very much missing in all of us, including myself, is backbone and courage. Now, that does not, we can't be ignorant about our backbone and just charge and run our face into a brick wall, because you're not going to get freedom from prison either, or if government goons come and blow your head off. But there has to be some level of opposition and resistance, even if it's careful and calculated. And it can't be super quiet either. Because as I covered in an episode on FDR's gold confiscation, I'm going to do a follow-up on this as well. The gold confiscation in and of itself was not super successful. Only about 25% of the gold was confiscated or turned in voluntarily. But what really had an impact was the fact that most people kept their gold and just held onto it quietly rather than using it as money because they were afraid of getting prosecuted. And so as long as people are afraid of getting prosecuted, they don't participate in the market, and they allowed the fiat dollar, the fiat funny money that they call the dollar, they allowed that to become the dominant medium of exchange rather than real money. And now it's a lot harder to get back to it. So anyways, here's how Thomas Paine put it. He said, "The strength and powers of despotism consist wholly in the fear of resisting it." So as long as people are afraid to stand up and exercise their rights, as Thomas Jefferson, the quote from earlier from 1774, "A free people claim their rights as derived from the laws of nature and not as a gift of their chief magistrate." As long as people are afraid to claim their rights and exercise their rights, whether they get permission from government or not, it's guaranteed we will have despotism. Samuel Adams summed it up like this: "The truth is, all might be free if they valued freedom and defended it as they ought." So that's kind of a combination of all of it. We have to love and value freedom. We have to understand it. And then we also have to understand and know the proper response to attacks on our freedom, on our liberty. We have to defend it as we ought. And defending your freedom as we ought is not about getting on our knees, complying with everything they do, and hoping that we'll somehow get new people in power and somehow they will, we'll see a couple of Supreme Court justices pass away, and then they'll be replaced, and then maybe in 5 or 10 or 15 years we'll get another thing overturned. That is not what a free people does. Again, that's a population on its knees begging for scraps. Now, again, it's not going to be easy. As Thomas Jefferson put it, he said, we can't expect to get from despotism to liberty in a featherbed. But Thomas Paine, in The American Crisis #4, we all often cite the first one where he says, "These are the times that try men's souls." But his fourth one, later in 1777, he put it like this: "Those who expect to reap the blessings of freedom must, like men, undergo the fatigues of supporting it." Well, I hope you guys found this interesting. I hope it was educational. More important than anything, I hope you learned something. There's nothing that helps us reach and teach more people about these essential foundational principles more than the financial faith and support of our members. You can join us over at 10thamendmentcenter.com/members for as little as $2 a month. If you got a couple of bucks of that quickly depreciating, dirty government fiat, please consider throwing it our way. No one punches above their weight class better than the TAC. So annual, lifetime, and 5-year options are also available. And while I'm here, I want to take a quick moment just to say a huge thank you to a handful of people who have joined us as members lately. There's Brian in Colorado, Thomas in Florida, Linda in Kentucky, Joe in Texas, and Jamie in Georgia. Thank you to you and to everyone else, old and new, who have been putting their financial faith behind our work. Thank you so much. I'm very grateful to any consideration you can give to joining them today. Again, 10thamendmentcenter.com/members. Again, I really appreciate you spending some of your time with me today. I hope you enjoyed this episode. I hope you learned something. I hope it made you think. That's really the most important thing. I hope you had an awesome weekend, and I hope to see you next time here on the path to liberty.